All right, so last week we went over a historical overview of what was the time and period of the book of Esther. And one of the slides that got skipped over last week somehow is this Cyrus cylinder. And I want to show it to y'all because it's actually really cool. So, we're familiar with Cyrus from Isaiah, from Chronicles, and this is his writing right here. It says, I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four rims of the earth. May all the gods whom I have resettled in their sacred cities ask daily Bel and Nebo for a long life for me. And may they recommend me to him, to Marduk my lord. May they say this, Cyrus the king who worships you and Cambyses his son. And then there's a little bit of a break there. And it says, all of them I settled in a peaceful place. I endeavored to fortify and repair their dwelling places. So one of Cyrus's big things that he did while as king, he let the Jews go back, but that was just part of a larger resettlement plan. The Babylonians and the Assyrians tended to take people out of the lands that they were in and resettle them as part of an attempt to keep rebellion and other things to a minimum. Cyrus had the opposite view of things. He sent them all home and said, you go home, and then you ask your gods to pray for me. So that was part of his, part of why he sent the Jews home, is that he was very interested in having all of the cultures and all of the religions that were part of the Persian Empire be praying for him on his behalf. I just found that really interesting. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead now to our next area. So this morning, I want to go into an overview of, is it stuck again? Because it's not advancing on the overhead here. I see Matt back there. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the overview. We'll get to the slide in just a second here. The first thing we want to talk about for the book of Esther is who wrote the book. Mordecai. Yeah, it's unknown. It could have been Mordecai. That's a valid thing to think about. What do we know for sure about the author, since we don't have a name in the book? Well, they must have written it after the events took place, right? And they probably wrote it before the time of the Maccabees. So if we look at when the book was written after the events, but before the mid-4th century BC. So somewhere probably between 450 and 350 BC is when the book of Esther was written. The next thing we want to consider is what kind of book is Esther? So as you're maybe familiar with, when we were studying the Old Testament, there's the books of the law, there's the prophets, there's the history, there's the poetry. What kind of book is Esther? Okay, it's history, but it's not quite written the same way as the other histories, is it? It's a little bit more of a narrative. So it's not one of the books of the law. It's not quite a history. It's a little bit more narrative than the book of Chronicles. But is it really historical narrative? And this is where there's some debate on the book itself. Due to some potential difficulties with aligning the book of Esther with what we know of history from non-biblical sources, is it possible that this is a work of fiction? Is it a comedy tale? Is Ahasuerus portrayed as a buffoon and Haman as a megalomaniac? Are the features exaggerated? Any thoughts on, or have you heard any of these things about the book of Esther? Because these are some of the things that people say about the book. There have been a number of, all right, no signal. There have been a number of attempts to discredit Esther's historical accuracy and characterize the book as something else. So, why would someone want the book to be fiction, a work of fiction? And what purpose would it serve in the Bible if it were? We're very quiet this morning.
It doesn't present Ahasuerus in a very positive light.
Okay, so it doesn't present Xerxes or Ahasuerus in a very positive light. It casts him a little bit as again, suggestion it casts him a little bit as a buffoon. All right. But what would the purpose be if it were like that? What purpose could the book serve? In other words, if you're an apologist and you're saying, well, maybe it's not a work of pure history, what else could we do with the book?
We might be able to treat it like a parable.
Okay.
And set our lives alongside of it.
So we might be able to treat it like a parable. And go ahead, Trish.
Well, if we didn't have that story, wouldn't that interrupt the lineage of Christ? If that's not a true story?
Well, that's Ruth. This is Esther.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Nope, no problem. All right. So there have been a number of attempts to discredit, as I said, the historical accuracy, to characterize it as a fictional narrative that's just written to give God's people hope. There were a number of those written during the Maccabean era. Things that we don't typically use canonically now, or characterize the book as a Greek romance, or a Persian chronicle, or a Jewish festival etology. And all that means is an explanation by the Jews for, here's how we got Purim. Or a wisdom tale, even. There have been attempts to classify it as that. Most such attempts to discredit the book fixate on one of these or more aspects. The first one is, we have a hard time pinpointing Vashti in secular historical records. So she might correlate with somebody that we'll see later, but it's hard to say, for example. It's hard to say exactly. We also can't find Esther in secular historical records, and there's no direct reference to Mordecai in secular historical records. Now, what do you see as a potential flaw with that argument?
It didn't say David lived until here recently.
Okay, yeah, that's a great one. We didn't have any information about several things until they come to light. There was a long period of time where people thought the Hittites were made up, and then we found the records of the Hittites. And now, as it turns out, the Hittites are really important for our understanding of ancient Near East covenants. And people couldn't find David. Now they've found evidence of David. So there's often times when archaeological and historical evidence just hasn't caught up yet to the Bible. What's another thing that comes into play here? Who did we mention last week? Do you remember who we mentioned last week as being the primary... there we go. That's actually advancing now. Excellent. There we go. All right. Who did we mention as being the primary historian of the day? It was Herodotus, right? And what was his particular nationality?
Greek.
He was Greek. And so, what's wrong with having a Greek historian write about the Persians? A little bit of bias because they were at war with each other, weren't they? Now, go ahead, Kyle.
And they're mostly given to fantasy.
Mostly given to fantasy, exactly. There was a little bit of exaggeration in some of those historical records that we see from people like Herodotus. All right, so the biggest issue here is that what we do have from the Persians is largely incomplete. The best histories we do have from that time period are a bit biased. Now, so who is the book about? Okay, overall it's about the Jewish nation. And which specific group of people of the Jewish nation? Where are they?
Captivity.
Okay, they're still in captivity. Now, as I mentioned previously, the events of this book happen in between the first and second return of the exiles. So that means there's a group of Jews that were allowed to return to Judea, but they haven't. So they find themselves in the Eastern Persian Empire. There are men and women who rose to prominence, like Daniel, but the kings were only lenient to a point. And you can read in Nehemiah how seriously the kings took even a whiff of rebellion. So what are these people doing here in Persia still, if they were allowed to go back home? All right. I see some shrugs. Think about it for a second. How long have they been here? At least. So if you go from the earliest captivity, the latest captivity to the earliest return date, that's a time span of 50 years. Okay? So, think about anybody who remembered anything about Jerusalem is probably at least 60 years old. Everybody else was born here in Babylon, Persia, or whatever. So let's say that someone says, hey, let's go back home, and I want you to walk about 800 miles, load all your stuff up onto a camel. I know many of you have retired here to College Station. What if you had to load all your stuff onto a camel and walk to College Station? Would you still want to retire to College Station? All right. How about if you had to load up all your stuff onto a camel, walk 800 miles, and then build your own house?
The infrastructure had completely changed during that time period that they were gone. There was nothing left for those people to go back to.
Exactly.
It's not like saying, I'm going to go live here for 2 or 3 years and then go back because, it didn't work out. But when they were allowed to go back, some were anxious to go back, but they needed strong backs and willing hearts to help make that possible. The second generation, or the generation that was born in captivity, had no knowledge of where these people had come from. They did not have personal ties to Jerusalem.
Exactly.
And it's like the Egyptians would have said, the Israelites would have said about the Egyptian captivity, you brought us out here in the desert to die. We were better off in Egypt where we had melons and pomegranates.
Yeah. It's a difficult prospect to say, pack up all your stuff and move. And for the younger generation, these people have never seen the temple. They don't remember Jerusalem. They have never lived in the promised land. What's it to them? And so many of them probably said, like we might have, that, you know what, all my friends are here. Everything I know about is here. What do I want to move for? And the older generation is a little less capable of making this massive move. Anybody that could remember Jerusalem and the temple, and then on top of that, I've got to rebuild my, all the infrastructure once we get there. Go ahead.
And it should have been really important to them, because they should have been being taught this the whole time they were in captivity. But what was happening is, the reason they were in captivity was because they had left God and worshiped idols. And then when they went to captivity, I'm not sure all of the families were teaching their children about God and about Jerusalem and the promises. And so I'm not sure they really understood how important, not everyone, and that's why such a small remnant ended up returning.
Exactly. All right. So to add to the tension that the Jews are facing here, Xerxes was known to be quite religious. He completed the palace at Persepolis in honor of the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda. I may be mispronouncing that terribly. And he doesn't take the same view that Cyrus did. You remember the Cyrus cylinder we saw. So Xerxes was a little bit more militant about making people worship his gods. So instead, Xerxes seems to have viewed the Jewish population and its religious customs as troublesome. All right, so if we look at the purpose of the book, we talked about this last week, but the purpose of the book of Esther is to describe the origins of the Feast of Purim. All right, so now we have some themes that we want to go over. And the primary theme of the book, we talked about this last week, is providence. And the providence of God can protect his people. But what are some other themes that we see throughout the book of Esther? Remnants, okay. So God always leaves a remnant of his people. What else? Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, our roles as co-laborers with God.
Our roles as co-laborers with God. So God is active in the world, but there are often things that we have to do in order to enact his will. And I think that kind of runs right into the next point, which is that God works with human behavior and responses to him. What did God say about Pharaoh when he wouldn't let the people go?
He was using Pharaoh for his purposes and for his glory with all the plagues that he was delivering unto him.
Yeah, he said, I used Pharaoh for my purposes. Pharaoh served what I wanted, even though it looked like Pharaoh was doing the exact opposite of what God asked. Well, he was. Pharaoh did the exact opposite of what God asked, but that still served God's purposes. That's the point I'm trying to make. All right, so here's a quick outline of Esther. In chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, we're going to get the setting and the banquet of Ahasuerus. In verses 10 through 22, we have the fall of Queen Vashti. In chapter 2, the rise of Mordecai and Esther. And then in chapter 3, we have Haman plotting against the Jews. In chapter 4, Mordecai and Esther are going to intercede in Haman's plot. Chapter 5, we have Esther's banquet. And then in chapter 6, this interlude where Haman is forced to honor Mordecai. And then in chapter 7, the fall of Haman, followed by chapters 8 through 10, where Mordecai is promoted and the Jews are saved. Now, if you're looking at this outline and you're adding up the number of weeks that we have, we're going to have to clip through this about the pace I've got up here. So, one of the thematic elements that I want you to pay attention to as we see it in the book is that of reversal, where man's purposes are turned against him in favor of God's purposes. So, just be on the lookout for occasions where that's happening. Despite the fact that Esther is themed around the providence of God and how God is active in the world, where is God in the book of Esther? Okay, he's not mentioned, as Peggy just said. So there's no mention of God. Can we still find God in the book of Esther? Now, interestingly enough, there is another book in the Bible where God isn't mentioned. You know what that one is? Song of Solomon. Okay, so Esther is not alone in what we consider biblical canon as far as not mentioning God. All right, so the first point, and since I've already revealed it, we'll just go ahead and talk about it, but Mordecai and Esther are revealed as Jewish. Did I hand out Esther chapter 2 and verse 5? I don't think I did, so I'll read that one real fast. It says, Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had carried away. All right. So you have Mordecai, you have Esther. And this is more than just ethnicity. Their ethnicity would have been Judean. So when they're mentioned as being Jewish, it is with respect to their religion. And what difference does that make? What difference does it make to call them Jews and imply that God is in the book of Esther? All right, we're quiet, so I'll give you a hint. What do we know about God's presence with regard to his people? Okay, he'll never leave them nor forsake them. So, what did we read last year? And you're reading in the Psalms. Does somebody have, I know I handed out the piece of paper. So somebody who has Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12, if you'll raise your hand so you can get a mic. There you go. Miles, if you'll read that for me.
Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you.
All right, and then I have somebody that's got Matthew 18:20. If you'll raise your hand. All right, over there, Scott.
Sorry, it's taking me a second to find my bookmark. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them.
All right. So what do those two verses say about God's presence with regard to his people? He's there. So if we have Jews in Esther, God is there. He is with them. And he is with his people. David talks about it in the Psalms. I can't escape the presence of God. Jesus talks about it in the New Testament. He says, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, I'm there. God is here with his people. Even though they are still in exile, even though they have remained behind and not gone on back to Canaan, he's here with them. All right. We have Mordecai, who refused to bow to Haman, giving as a reason that he was a Jew, implying public observance of Jewish law. Any other famous exiles who refused to bow? All right, Daniel chapter 3 and verse 12. Who's my reader for that? Got Brother Dabney over here.
Daniel 3:12 in the New American Standard, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you've set up.
So that's kind of a known thing about the Jews, is that they don't serve the gods of Babylon or Persia or the Medes. They're a known quantity. All right. The Jews were known to have different laws. Who has Esther chapter 3 and verse 8? It's Mike McCassin.
Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them.
Now, I think that verse is really interesting because they're known not to keep the king's laws. Which ones specifically is it likely that it's talking about here? Yeah, the religious laws of the day and the religious orders. Back in the time of the Persian Empire, there was no such thing as separation of church and state. So part of Xerxes and Cyrus and all of these other emperors of Persia, they feel that they have been given their authority and rule by their gods. They rule with the authority of their gods. And they speak for them. So if you're not doing what Xerxes says, you're not just defying Xerxes, you're defying Ahura Mazda, his god. All right. So then we have relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews. We talked about that last week as kind of the main theme of Esther. And that's a statement of faith. Where does Mordecai have this idea that relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews? Why would he say something like that? Okay, it's been their entire history, right? I didn't have any verses because there's just too many of them where God's people are oppressed and he raises up a deliverer for them, and then they are oppressed and he raises up a deliverer for them. Here are the people in Persia. They are about to be oppressed by Haman. And so Mordecai says, there's going to be a deliverer for us. That's how it always works. That's a statement of faith. All right. And last we have Esther that requested the Jews in Susa fast for 3 days. And the implication is an appeal for divine support. What is fasting frequently associated with in the Bible? Prayer. Okay. I have Ezra chapter 8 and verse 23. Who's got that? Over there. Chandler? And then Acts 13:3 is going to be next. So Justin, if you want to grab that person. All right, go ahead, Chandler.
So we fasted and entreated our God for this, and he answered our prayer.
Okay, and then Acts 13:3. Who has that one? Sorry, you're on this side here.
So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off.
Okay, so Old and New Testament fasting and prayer are frequently seen together. Fasting is seen throughout the Bible as having religious implications of some kind. So this isn't just, fasting for the sake of fasting on Esther's part. And then last, we have the Feast of Purim described in Esther chapter 9. All of the Jewish feasts were aligned with what? Well, what kind of feasts did they have? Did the Jews have secular holidays?
Celebration, victory feasts.
Okay, so all of their feasts were generally for what purpose? To glorify God. It's a feast to the Lord. There is a direction to their feasting. It's to the glory of God. All right. So let's talk about the main. So here's the main characters in Esther. Here's again the Persian Empire. Let's skip here. All right. Here's King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, and this is actually a really interesting slide. I think it's fascinating that we have a recording of what he more or less looked like. A rendition here. All right. So Xerxes ruled Persia from 485 to 465 BC. He was about 36 years old when he became king. And, he was the son and successor of Darius I, who selected him over his elder brother. Who was Darius?
King after Cyrus.
Okay, he was the king after Cyrus. What do we know Darius for in the Bible?
He went back and found the proclamation that Cyrus had made.
Okay. And we also know him from the book of Daniel, right? Darius was the one that had Daniel thrown into the den of lions. Same guy. All right. So here's Herodotus portrayed Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as an ambitious, bold warrior with vision and confidence who had many superstitious fears. He was also known for his exploits with women, and he was very intent on having his own way. He was sort of a typical, powerful Middle Eastern king of this time period. All right, so who is Queen Vashti? Well, Herodotus' details include Xerxes' wife's name as Amestris, and there are some modern historians who argue that this is phonetically equivalent to Vashti. I am not enough of a scholar of this time period to say that one way or the other is true or false. But there you have it, just in case that makes a difference to you. Amestris is portrayed as being ambitious, scheming, and vindictive, and she helps consolidate Xerxes' rule. There are multiple references to him in the histories, which again, that's Herodotus, until Xerxes' 7th year, which, interestingly enough, probably corresponds with Esther chapter 2 and verse 16. And there is no further mention until she's active in the royal court again when her son Artaxerxes assumes the throne. So, from Xerxes' 7th year until he dies and his son takes the throne, there is no mention of Queen Vashti, Queen Amestris. How about Mordecai? Who is he? He's his great-great-grandfather Kish was taken captive from Jerusalem along with Jeconiah. So his lineage indicates his family was of some importance. The expression sitting in the king's gate that we see in Esther chapter 2 and verse 21 probably means to hold an office in the palace administration. You remember when we talked in the book of Ruth, where did important business go on? It happened at the gates. So if he's sitting at the king's gate, he is probably an official whose job it is to take people coming up to him with problems, and he's sort of the filter. You have to get past him before you go to see anybody higher in authority. And interestingly enough, there's a man named Marduka who's mentioned in a text dated to the 5th century, who served as an accountant on an inspection tour from Susa. Now, Marduka sounds a little bit like Mordecai, and what did the Babylonians and Persians have a habit of doing with their captives? They rename them. Who do they rename them after? I heard it. They rename them after their gods. Who's one of the gods of the Persians? Marduk. So, it's entirely possible that Mordecai, who sounds a lot like Marduk, that this is the same guy. Possible. We don't know for sure. Now, I love maps. So, the King's Gate stood between, does the pointer work? King's Gate stood between the royal city and the palace here, excuse me, and the outer courtyard of the royal palace. It was the main entrance to the palace compound, and access to this gate was over a bridge that crossed a moat. Yeah, let's go back to that for a second, because there's, you can see here, we'll see it again this would have been the moat right here. We'll see it again in one of the later slides. But let's talk about Esther real fast. Who was Esther? What do we know about her? Okay, she's Mordecai's niece. She was an orphan. She was raised by her cousin or uncle Mordecai. What is her general attitude towards Mordecai? Okay, she's respectful to him. What else do we know about how old was she?
13 to 15.
Okay, so she was probably a teenager when selected. It says the young lady was beautiful of form and face in Esther chapter 2 and verse 7. What else do we know about her character? What was her personality like, besides beyond just being respectful to Mordecai?
She wanted to do the right thing.
She wanted to do the right thing. She exhibited exceptional wisdom and bravery for someone who was as young as she was. All right, last but not least, who's Haman? Well, we know that he was promoted to the number 2 position, which implies some level of administrative competence. So he was at least sort of good at his job. He's also ambitious and vain. I kind of call him the quintessential bad guy, sort of the mustache-twirling villain of the book of Esther. He's everything that we think of when we think about villainous behavior. He's prideful, he's arrogant, he's over the top almost. All right, so here we have a timeline of the captivity and return. And here you can see probably between the dates of about 465 and 480 is when Esther would have been queen. Wrong way. There we go. Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. Who do I have reading that? Go ahead, Ben.
Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was in Susa, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Susa the capital, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful, according to the king's bounty. And the drinking was done according with the law. There was no compulsion, so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus.
All right. This is the royal inscription of Xerxes, and it's the beginning of a longer cuneiform inscription written in Old Persian. The letters were originally highlighted in white to make the inscription more legible. It reads, "I am Xerxes the great king, the king of kings, the king of countries having many kinds of people, the king in this great earth, far and wide, the son of Darius the king, an Achaemenian." I like this next one. This is an image from the tomb of Xerxes I. And I apologize if the things up here are a little hard to read, but That's soldiers of different nations, labeled in cuneiform to denote their nationality. So you have Persians, Medians, Elamites, Parthians, you have Hindush, Cappadocian, Lydian, Ionian, Libyan, Ethiopian, and quite a few more. They're all named up there. So that's from his tomb, and those are all the nations that supported his reign, according to the Persians at least. So he really was king over a very large portion of the world. Come on, next one. It stopped advancing again. All right. So, and actually, I want those slides up there. So, can we get that? I see heads shaking. All right. We're having some technical difficulties again, which is, I've got an entire slide deck of great images from the Persian Empire, and if we don't see them, you'll just have to believe me. In verse 3, it talks about he held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials from the provinces. You think about how many people that would have had to have been for him to have thrown a banquet of that size. And I have an image of the officers that they put in glazed brick relief. And if we have time, we'll get to that. We're going to move on to verse 4, where it talks about the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for 180 days. Now, I want you to think about, first of all, the duration of that party. How long is 180 days?
6 months.
6 months. He threw a party for 6 months. Okay, so that's the first thing that's interesting here. And I think the other thing we kind of miss is just how much food and other... Oh, here we go. Here's the officers in the glazed brick relief. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the honor of his great majesty, these are gold appliques from courtly garments. This is artwork that they've found. That little chariot there is about 7 inches long. I don't know if you can see the detail on that thing, but it is absolutely incredible how detailed they did these gold pieces. We find ourselves disconnected sometimes from these figures in the Bible. It's hard to imagine the wealth of Solomon, Xerxes, and these other kings. Wealth in our society looks a little bit different, doesn't it? What do we normally think of as wealth? We have investments, or we have stocks, or other intangible assets. I can't tell what your investments look like. But these guys displayed their wealth openly. And we do have some physical representations of wealth in our society. Recently, when Russia invaded Ukraine, you had all these oligarchs that had these yachts seized. If you saw articles about these things, are huge, massive, massive boats, ships. I'm not sure what the correct term is. But generally, what's that? Go see Versailles, yeah. Wealth in our society doesn't manifest as gold eating utensils or art or gold architectural accents the way it did back then. You go look at places in Europe and Asia that are preserved, that have some of that stuff. Absolutely amazing. Some of the Rococo and the other styles that they used back even just a couple hundred centuries ago. Beautiful things. Very blatant statements of wealth. And Xerxes doesn't skimp. It makes it easier, I think, to internalize just how much wealth and power these people had when you can see things like that. All right. So, looking more to the east, this view shows the middle and outer courtyards of the royal palace, as well as the area of the king's gate over here, which is where it talks about Mordecai sitting, and over here the royal palace, the middle courtyard, the outer courtyard. And then the royal city is over here past, you can kind of see that ditch, I guess, which would have been the moat around the city, or excuse me, the palace there. Archaeologists have identified 4 parts of the ancient city. The Apadana, which includes the royal palace, the royal city to the east, the Acropolis, from which this photo was taken, and the lower city, east of the royal city, which was dubbed by an excavator as the city of the artisans. The Apadana is located on the northern end of the Palace of Susa. The throne pedestal is located in the center at the southern end of the audience hall. The throne hall, there are two thrones. There's the first one that's located within the royal residence. All right, so that's this one here, and we'll see that one later. The other throne that's mentioned here in verse 5 is this one that's over here in the Apadana, where the throne pedestal is in the image there. The throne on which Ahasuerus sat while hosting the banquet in these verses is the one in the Apadana. This is a photo of the Apadana at Persepolis to give you an idea of what the one at Susa might have looked like, because the one at Susa was destroyed. Now, the Apadana, you can see it's located on an elevated platform. There's a staircase leading up to it that's visible on the near side. That's here. And with the surrounding porticos, the Apadana at Susa was 350 by 350 feet, which makes it larger than the Apadana at Persepolis. The size of the central hall, so that there's porticos surrounding it, and then the central hall, that's 185 by 185 feet. Now, to get a sense of scale, that means the Apadana alone is 122,500 square feet. How big is that? Well, the Jones Crossing HEB is 109,000 square feet. The Jones Crossing HEB would have fit inside just the Apadana of the Royal Palace here at Susa. I don't know if you can see the pillars there, but there's a person, there's the pillars. If you're just kind of at a guesstimate, those are somewhere between 30 and 40 feet tall. So you have 122,500 square feet of banquet space with 40-foot ceilings. And these guys didn't have cranes to build that stuff. All right. Here's a photo of the reconstruction of the Apadana to kind of give you a sense of the scale of this thing. So that's the banquet that's being held. All right, so then in verse 7 through 9, it talks about the golden vessels. They drank out of golden cups that looked like this. This is a photo from the Riza Abbasi Museum in Tehran. All right, so that brings us through verse 9, and I have just a minute left. So I'll reserve the last minute of class for two things. First of all, any questions, comments, or anything like that that anybody wants to bring up? All right, second thing, just a little bit of bookkeeping here. I handed out little pieces of paper with verses on them this week. If you didn't get one and you're interested in reading, let me know. I will have more next week to hand out, and be more than happy to have as many readers. Steve, I know you've got 10 through 22, so if you just want to hang on to that one, we'll get to you next week, because it looks like we are pretty much out of time here. All right, thank you all for your kind attention.